Hello everyone, welcome back to the Every Next.js Feature series. In part 2 of this series, I will be discussing the API Routes feature in Next.js. I will explain what API Routes are and showcase how the page in the app consumes data from an API route. Finally, we'll build out a test with Cypress to automate the testing of an API route. If you're not familiar with this project, here's a quick summary. I'm building a Next.js app with the pages-based architecture that will use every feature of Next.js, because I want to test out what features actually work on a given hosting provider, say AWS Amplify, Azure Static Web Apps, Cloudflare Pages. Do they support static rendering, server rendering, middleware, API routes? So I'm isolating Next.js features and writing automated tests for them with Cypress. I hope to generate reports of what actually works on all hosting providers for Next.js. Jumping back into part 2, let's start off with what are API routes in Next.js. API routes in Next.js allow you to build a public API. That means that you can build specific routes into your application to serve as an API endpoint. These API routes are server-side and are serverless functions that are meant to be short-lived, single-purpose functions. It's important to note that the terminology API route is specific to the Next.js pages architecture. In app router architecture, you would use routes or server actions to achieve similar goals. Next.js allows you to build specific routes in your app that will act as an API endpoint. This project uses the pages-based Next.js architecture, so any files under pages/API will be an API route. You access or hit your API routes just like you would a page. So if you go to www.yoururl.com/API/hello, this would execute the API route code found in pages/API/hello. One way of using API routes is as a proxy to some other third-party service that you need access to. For instance, if you're using a geolocation service in your app and you want to keep your API key private from the client side, you can send the request to an API route. The API route running server-side that has access to your private API key makes a request on your behalf, then returns whatever data comes back to the client side. So you're using the API route as a proxy to hide sensitive data on the server side instead of having it exposed on the client. Now let's jump into the app that I've built, take a look at the API routes feature, and see how we can build a test against it with Cypress. All right, so here we are in our application. This is the Next.js Every Feature app. I've got my dev environment running, and I do have an API routes page already created. If we go to this, it takes me to /feature/API route, and we see Charmander. But where are we getting this from? How is this testing API routes? So let's take a peek at what this page is actually doing. So let's head over to that page. So inside of pages, we have the API routes page. Inside of here, we have a use state for Pokemon, and we're setting that state inside of a use effect. And right now we have our get Pokemon from API route that calls the /API/get Pokemon. So that's going to call the API route get Pokemon inside of our application. And now the reason I'm using a use effect in here, ideally in your application, you'd probably be using a get static props or a get server side props, but I didn't want to introduce that extra layer of complexity, that extra feature being tested. So we're doing this client side call to our API route to hopefully clear out as many variables as possible, keep this just a test of our API route. So the idea is if we're able to fetch data from that API route and it properly displays that Pokemon on the page, then we consider this a successful use of an API route. Checking out our API route, we can find that in API get Pokemon. Inside of here, we're doing a very simple request. We have a request handler. That handler, when it gets called, is going to reach out to Poke API and ask for the fourth Pokemon, which is Charmander. We send that data back as JSON, returning the name and the image. We're just doing this really simple, sending that 200 response back. This is very basic use of an API handler. Maybe I should add some error handling in the future, but I want to keep things as simple as possible, at least especially in this POC status that we're currently in. So we have an API route, that API/get Pokemon. We're calling it inside of our page, and we are displaying that Pokemon on the page. And the idea here is that a successfully showing a Pokemon on the page means a successful API route call. Now, the one thing that I don't have is a test for this. So if we go over to Cypress, I have EDE, and right now I've created a Cypress file for each one of my different features, and we might adjust that in the future, but I think I'm going to stick with that sort of theme right now. So in here, we're going to call it API routes.cy.ts, and this is going to create this is where we're going to create a Cypress test. And I might just steal something from our server side here just so it gets an idea. We have this describe. I'll explain this once I paste it in. Describe up in here is where we're going to want to put the description of our test as kind of like what's going to go all the tests in here. This is kind of a general broad idea of what's going to happen inside of this file. So this is the API route support. And we want to see the it is going to be an individual test. So in here, we should show Charmander on the API routes page. And I'll just say on the page. Now, what we got here on line 3, let me make this bigger because I got some room. On line 3 here, we're saying Cypress, go visit the environment variable URL. And I have that set up so that we can easily test more providers. The idea is that I'm going to provide, or you're going to provide, a URL into the Cypress environment variables, and that'll test against production. Say you're hosting on Vercel or Netlify, they give you that preview URL or the production URL. You can point this application at that URL, and it will test all these different features against that URL. And that lives inside of the root of our application in the Cypress config. You can see that my environment variable URL is localhost 3000. So that's what I'm going to be testing against right now. The next step is that we're going to be on the home page of our application. We want to click the element with the ID server. And right now it's clicking the element with the ID server, but we don't want to use the ID server. We're going to be using the ID API route. If we go to the homepage link, we can see that the page link also is used for the ID as well as the link to the page itself. So we want to make sure that Cypress can click on the proper route. And we want to then see that we should be on the API routes page. The should will return true or false based on if it actually includes the URL API route. So we want to make sure that quick little test there. And last, on line 7, we want to see that it says Charmander in the p tag of our page because we want to make sure that the Charmander name is what's displayed there. That's how we can test against this API route. And again, these are very basic tests. I'm just doing, hey, am I getting the data that I expect on the page? And I think at this point, that's a good enough test. We are able to test that data is coming back from our API route. If we're not seeing Charmander, if we're not seeing the name there in that p tag, it means that we did not successfully get data back from our API route. So we can consider it a fail. Now let's actually run these Cypress tests and make sure that they're actually working. What was my Cypress command? I could look in my package JSON, Cypress open. So npm run Cypress open. This should open up Cypress. We want to do E2E testing. We'll be doing it inside of Chrome. That's fine. And let's go to our API routes. That's what we're interested in. Test is loading. It should actually run our test for us right now. Visit localhost and visit and see that you get Charmander. And we want to actually make sure this test fails for the right reasons. So a test passing is great, but we aren't testing that it can possibly fail for the right reason. So let's actually head back into our code, and in my API route, I'll make a change. So instead of get Pokemon, where I return the name here, I'm going to put in Charizard. So we're now going to be returning that wrong data back. If I head into Cypress and rerun all tests, it will run. We do get to the correct URL, but it's looking for Charmander, seeing Charizard, and we can see that times out. Expected to find content Charmander within the element, but never did. It's finding Charizard, which is great. That's our test is failing for the right reason. We're seeing that if we get the wrong data back from our API route or no data back, that it will properly fail. Take that API route change back so we know what we're working with. And that's API route testing in here. We now have an automated test in Cypress that will test our application and make sure that the API routes functionality is working. If I go back to my specs, I can run all of our tests and just make sure that everything's still working as expected within our application now that we've added this new test. Perfect. All the tests are passing right now. So I'm feeling confident with this code. I've got tests for my other features in Next.js. I've added this API route support feature test. And I think next up, in the next episode, part 3 of this series, I want to start testing on different hosting providers. I might just start with Vercel or Netlify, one of the easy ones, because I know things are going to work, so I can at least take the happy path there. But I want to start sending this out to different hosting providers because these are some of the big features that we want to use, especially when we're building against CMSs like XM Cloud or Content Hub 1. We really want that image optimization support. The incremental static regeneration ISR support's really important. Middleware, get server-side props, get static props. We've got some of those really initial core features of Next.js tested. So I think we're at a point where we can start adding this to different hosting providers and see what kind of data they return back, see what kind of support they have for Next.js and the pages architecture and these different features. I know there's a lot more features to add, so let me know what important features you think are missing, what features are you using in Next.js that you need tested against different hosting providers, and leave a comment down below of what those features are. And with that, thanks for watching. I hope you liked the video. If you did, leave it a like and make sure to subscribe. Thanks.